She had always been fascinated by mirrors. Ever since she was a child, she would spend hours standing in front of one, making faces, adjusting her hair, or simply staring into her own eyes. It was an odd habit, but harmless. Or so she thought. That evening, she stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, brushing her hair absent-mindedly. The golden light of the setting sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the glass. She smiled at her reflection, expecting it to smile back. But it didn't. Her hands froze mid-brush. Maybe it was a trick of the light? She leaned in, studying the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, expressionless, unblinking. A shiver ran down her spine. She forced a nervous laugh. I must be seeing things, she whispered to herself. But then, to her horror, her reflection's lips moved. The voice that came out wasn't hers, but it sounded eerily familiar. Finally, it whispered, "You're mine." Before she could react, a cold, invisible force gripped her wrist and yanked her forward. She barely had time to scream before she was pulled into the mirror. The world around her twisted, colors blending into a whirlpool of light and shadow. When she blinked, she found herself standing in a cold, dark place. The mirror world. She spun around, heart hammering against her ribs. There was no sky, no ground, just endless reflections stretching infinitely. It was like being inside a prism, yet there was no warmth, no light. She pressed her palms against the glass wall that separated her from her bedroom. On the other side, standing exactly where she had been just moments ago, was her reflection. But it wasn't her. It was something else, something that wore her face. She pounded against the glass, screaming, but no sound escaped. Her reflection smiled, a slow, knowing smile, then turned away and walked out of the room, walking into her life. Days passed, maybe weeks. Time felt strange in the mirror world. She watched helplessly as her reflection lived in her place. It laughed with her friends, ate at her table, and talked to her family. No one noticed the difference. No one realized that the person they were speaking to wasn't real. At first, she thought it would make a mistake, slip up somehow. But it didn't. It moved with perfect confidence, knowing things only she would know, behaving exactly as she would. The worst part was watching how easily it deceived everyone. One evening, as she watched her reflection brush her hair in the mirror, she realized something terrifying. The reflection wasn't just pretending to be her. It had become her. And she was nothing more than a prisoner in the glass. She ran through the endless corridors of reflections, searching for an escape, but there was none. The mirror world stretched infinitely in all directions, a labyrinth of glass and shadows. Sometimes, she caught glimpses of others, people like her, trapped behind their reflections. Some were screaming, pounding at the glass. Others had given up, staring blankly into nothingness. That was when she understood. This had happened before. Many times. Her reflection wasn't just living her life. It was waiting for the next person to stand too long in front of the mirror, waiting for someone else to smile at their own reflection, waiting for a new victim to take her place. She didn't know how long she stood there, watching, as despair settled deep in her bones. She had been so sure of who she was, so certain that reality was unshakable. But now she knew the truth. The girl who existed in the real world wasn't her anymore. And the next time someone waved at their reflection, the cycle would begin again. Somewhere, in another home, another unsuspecting soul stood in front of a mirror, smiling. And in the shadows of the glass, something else was smiling back, waiting. Sarah had always been a quiet child, more comfortable with books and her collection of dolls than with other children. Among her many dolls, there had been one she loved the most, Charlotte. Charlotte had been a gift from her grandmother on her 5th birthday. The doll had long golden curls, bright blue glass eyes, and a little pink dress with lace trimmings. For years, Charlotte had been Sarah's constant companion, whispering secrets only they knew, sharing dreams and stories no one else could understand. Then, one day, Charlotte was gone. Sarah had searched everywhere. She had turned her room upside down, emptied her toy chest, and checked every dark corner where she might have dropped her beloved doll. But Charlotte had vanished without a trace. It had broken Sarah's heart. She had cried for days, refusing to believe that the doll had simply disappeared. Her parents had tried to comfort her, offering new dolls, but none of them were Charlotte. Eventually, she stopped asking about her lost doll. Time passed, and childhood faded into memory. Years later, Sarah was no longer a little girl. She was a young woman now, living on her own in a small apartment. Life had moved on, and though she sometimes thought of Charlotte with a bittersweet nostalgia, she never expected to see her again. That was until last night. When Sarah returned home from work, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed, she froze in the doorway of her bedroom. There, sitting neatly in the center of her bed, was Charlotte. The doll's once pristine pink dress was now faded and dusty, her golden curls tangled, but her glassy blue eyes still gleamed under the dim light. And her lips, Sarah could swear they were stretched into a grin that hadn't been there before. Her heart pounded. This wasn't possible. She had lost Charlotte years ago. How could she be here now? A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had found the doll and placed it there as a cruel joke. But who would do such a thing? She lived alone. No one had a key to her apartment. Sarah hesitated before stepping closer. She reached out with trembling hands and picked up the doll. The moment she touched it, an eerie sensation crawled over her skin, like invisible fingers brushing against her arms. She quickly set Charlotte back down. Her breathing was uneven. This had to be her imagination. Maybe she was just overtired, seeing things that weren't there. Forcing herself to calm down, Sarah placed the doll on a chair in the corner of the room and climbed into bed, pulling the covers over her head like she used to when she was a scared little girl. Sleep was difficult. Every creak in the apartment made her flinch. Every shadow seemed to shift in the darkness. And though she told herself she was being ridiculous, she could have sworn she heard the faintest sound of fabric rustling, like something moving across the room. When morning came, Sarah opened her eyes, feeling groggy and unrest. But the moment she turned her head to the side, her breath caught in her throat. Charlotte was no longer on the chair. The doll's head was on her pillow, inches from her own face. Her mouth went dry. The doll's body was nowhere in sight, just the head lying there, its painted lips slightly parted, as if it had been whispering to her all night. Then, in a voice so faint it could have been a trick of the wind, she heard it. "Miss me," Sarah screamed. She scrambled out of bed, knocking over the nightstand in her panic. The doll's head rolled to the floor, landing face up, those blue glass eyes staring unblinkingly at her. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Dolls didn't whisper. Dolls didn't move on their own. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed her mother's number. "Mom," she gasped. "Charlotte, the doll, she's here." There was silence on the other end before her mother finally spoke, her voice hesitant. "Sarah, honey, what are you talking about?" "My doll. The one I lost when I was little. She's in my apartment." Another pause. Then her mother sighed. "Sarah, we got rid of Charlotte years ago. You don't remember?" Sarah's breath hitched. "What? You were so attached to that doll," her mother said softly. "But you started talking to her too much. You'd say she whispered things to you, things that scared you. You used to wake up crying, saying Charlotte was watching you while you slept. You don't remember any of this." Sarah's mind reeled. No, that wasn't possible. She would have remembered, wouldn't she? "We had to get rid of her," her mother continued. "We didn't want to upset you, so we told you she was lost." Sarah's legs felt weak. She sank to the floor, staring at the doll's head, the glass eyes glinting as if they knew something she didn't. A faint chill wrapped around her, seeping into her bones. If Charlotte had been thrown away, then how was she here now? As her mother's voice faded into the background, Sarah turned her gaze toward the mirror across the room. She needed to see herself, to ground herself in reality. But the moment she looked, her stomach twisted in horror. Her reflection was smiling. Not just smiling, smirking, doll-like, unblinking. Sarah's breath hitched. She lifted a trembling hand to her face, but in the mirror, her reflection didn't move. It just stared at her, its eyes glassy and vacant, lips curled into a knowing grin. And then, it spoke. "Miss me." Sarah's screams filled the empty apartment, but no one was there to hear them. The reflection tilted its head, stepping closer to the glass, pressing its hands against it as if trying to reach out. And as Sarah stumbled backward, her own body trembling, she felt a cold, invisible force tighten around her. The air around her grew heavier, pressing in from all sides, suffocating her. Then, as she blinked, the world around her shifted. She was no longer in her bedroom. She was in the mirror, trapped behind the glass. And on the other side, her reflection stood, stretching, rolling its shoulders as if getting comfortable in its new body. Sarah pounded against the mirror, screaming, begging, but the thing wearing her face only grinned. It picked up the doll's head from the floor, cradling it gently in its hands. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it turned back to the mirror, its unblinking doll-like eyes locking onto Sarah's. "Don't worry," it whispered. "I'll take good care of your life." And then, it walked away, leaving Sarah behind, forever trapped in the cold, endless world of the mirror. Jake had always been afraid of the dark. Even as an adult, he found himself avoiding looking under the bed at night, as if some childhood fear still lingered in the back of his mind. He had convinced himself that he was too old for such nonsense, that there was nothing to fear. But that night changed everything. He had just settled into bed, the room quiet except for the ticking of the clock on his nightstand. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. He was drifting between wakefulness and sleep when he heard it, a whisper, faint, barely audible, but definitely there. Jake's eyes snapped open. He held his breath, straining to listen. The whisper came again, a hushed voice speaking in a tone so quiet it almost blended with the night. It was coming from under his bed. His heart pounded against his ribs. His rational mind told him it was his imagination, that he was half asleep and hearing things. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice, and it was calling his name. A chill ran down his spine. His throat felt dry. Slowly, he shifted under the covers, trying to convince himself that it was nothing, that he was just tired. But the whispers continued, growing more insistent, more desperate. He hesitated before moving. Then, against his better judgment, he leaned over the edge of the bed and peered into the darkness beneath. His breath caught in his throat. Under the bed, staring back at him, was himself. It wasn't just a reflection or a trick of the light. It was him, his own face, wide-eyed, filled with fear. The other Jake looked terrified, his mouth slightly open as if gasping for breath. His hands were clutching the floor, fingers digging into the carpet as if he was holding on for dear life. Jake felt his entire body go numb. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but he was frozen in place. He couldn't look away. Then, the other him spoke. "Don't get up," he whispered, his voice urgent, trembling. "It's not me on the bed." Jake's blood turned to ice. He barely registered that he had stopped breathing. His brain struggled to process the words, to make sense of what was happening. Not me on the bed. A slow, creeping horror washed over him. His body stiffened as realization sank in. If he was under the bed, then who, or what, was lying on top of it? He felt movement behind him, a shifting weight on the mattress, the sensation of something adjusting itself, like a person stretching or turning in their sleep. He wanted to believe it was just his imagination, that the presence behind him wasn't real. But deep down, he knew better. The other him under the bed reached out a trembling hand. "Please," he begged. "Don't move. Don't let it know you've seen me." Jake's hands clenched into fists. His mind raced with possibilities. Was he dreaming? Was this some kind of hallucination? None of it made sense, but the fear in the voice beneath him was real. And so was the feeling of something breathing just inches away from his back. He wanted to turn. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to check, to see what was behind him. But something inside told him that if he did, if he made even the smallest movement, whatever was on the bed would know. And then, he didn't want to think about what would happen next. Time seemed to stretch. Every second felt like an eternity. He forced himself to stay still, to keep his breathing even, to pretend he was still asleep. The air around him grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. He could hear something shifting again, something moving closer. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to disappear, to wake up and find it was all just a nightmare. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispers stopped. The presence behind him vanished. The weight on the bed lifted, and the room fell silent. Jake stayed motionless for what felt like hours. When he finally dared to open his eyes, the first rays of morning light were spilling through the window. Trembling, he turned his head just enough to see his empty bed. There was nothing there. No sign of anyone or anything. Just his rumpled blankets and the fading echoes of terror. Slowly, hesitantly, he peered under the bed again. It was empty. Jake sat up, his body drenched in cold sweat. He pressed his hands against his face, trying to steady his breathing. Had it been real? A nightmare? His logical mind wanted to dismiss it as a bad dream, a trick of exhaustion. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something had been there that night. Something had watched him, whispered to him, and it had worn his face. From that night on, Jake never looked under his bed again.